Mr. Begley, members of the board, we have several items for board discussion this evening. Our first item is staffing needs 2022-2023. And at this time, I'll turn it over to Ms. Thompson and Ms. Gilbert.
Good evening. Thank you for letting myself and Jenny talk to you about some of our needs for next school year for our special education department. We have 3 different items. The first item is to hire a school psychologist that will assist at our 2 middle schools and also our out-of-district students. They are at their maximum caseloads. So between MTSS, the reevaluations, the initial evaluations per ODE, we need to increase our staffing. The good news is that we did receive some extra funds from ODE this year for special education and for next year. And we can at least pay for this position next year out of these funds. So we won't have to hit the general fund until the following year. The second item is we have a large number of preschoolers moving into kindergarten next year, and the students that are incoming have a lot of needs. We have many that are on the autism spectrum and have multiple disabilities and are medically fragile. Due to this, we have to increase our units, which would mean 2 intervention specialists, 1 for each unit, and 2 educational assistants because the needs are so great, they can't do it alone. And then Jenny will talk about the new preschool law, unless you have any questions for me about those 2 positions yet before I hand it over to Jenny.
I do have a question.
Okay.
The psychologist, the 2 psychologists, just wondering if that is something that could go through Butler County Educational Services. Is that possible that you guys look at that? I'm just wondering, or do you want me to wait until?
No, you're fine.
Okay.
We could contract that out with like Butler County ESC or with Hamilton County ESC. I can tell you it is much higher because they charge per hour. And anytime we have to contract out special education services, it's better for us to hire our own because we get it at a better price.
Okay.
Their prices are very high for school psychologists.
Okay.
I do have one question.
Sure.
Do you know what the larger influx of the need is?
We are getting many foster children throughout pre-K through 12. And they pretty much all, many of them have special needs where they either need one of our units or they need a separate facility. The good news is those that need a separate facility, we can recoup that money back a year later. We also have found that many of our parents kept their children home due to COVID, the nasty word. And this year, we have been doing so many preschool evaluations that we're pretty much at max for our preschool special education program.
So I guess part B, yeah, I 100% agree. We need to be there and help those students, those children, the families. Because we saw this coming, or we talked about it, not just we, but in general, that nasty word COVID was going to have an effect on kids. And it has, and it will be. So I guess this may be ongoing for quite some time. So
we're getting hit very hard for our units, our autism classrooms that we call social communication and our multiple disabilities. The kids that are coming into our preschool program have significant needs. They are not just articulation needs. They are OT, PT, speech, not being able to function in a normal sized classroom. So we have to shrink their world so that they can have success in the school environment.
Yeah, I'm afraid it's the start of something that is going to be ongoing for a while.
I'm hoping not.
Well, I hope not too, but, it's all about the kids.
Yes.
And I'm glad we can be there, but I don't think it's a one-year fix, I guess is what I'm saying, or stating. So,
I unfortunately agree with you.
thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions before I let Jenny talk about new preschool laws?
Just another one, because you mentioned that it was an increase in foster parents here. Do you have any idea as to why that, is it because of the pandemic? I mean, what's increasing that? Is it, I'm just curious. as to-
Well, we now have One Way Farm that has reopened in our district, and that is a residential facility for children in the foster care system. So many of those students are on IEPs. So that has brought a huge caseload to our district and a lot of legwork to make sure we're meeting those needs. And then we have a lot of parents that are taking in foster children that's in our district. And so many of them have IEPs that we have to cover as well.
And Ms. Short, I would maybe kind of add to that, because of the nasty word COVID and with the drug issue that's been going on, I think there's a lot more kids, unfortunately, going into the foster program. Hopefully the parents can get help and come back out of that, but I think there's a sickness with that, with drugs that's causing some of that foster student increase.
And just so you know, I have reached out to the Butler County districts just to see, are we over-identifying students with special needs? Our numbers are extremely comparable. Middletown is actually over 20%. We are nowhere near 20%. So it's not that we're over-identifying, it's just the kids that we are receiving, it is obvious that they need supports. And these are expensive supports that they need.
Would it be possible to give just a general idea for the public as to the comparison of a typical student, where I think it was noted that we are under the state typical by $2,000 per student, but when we have students with special needs this severe and on the autism spectrum, where it's not just the communication and social emotional thing, on the ballpark, what is that delta, so that our public understands why we're asking so many questions and why we're trying to get an understanding of what's happening?
So I'm sorry, I couldn't hear all that.
Can you give an idea of the delta between what the state typically provides for one of our typical students versus a student that has functional needs?
Oh, the amount of
The
money.
delta.
We receive for students that are identified as autism or multiple disabilities, we receive approximately $25,000 for their education. And then there's also something called catastrophic costs. And that's where if students meet a certain threshold, we can gain more money from the state to help offset our special education costs. And that we're in the process right now of seeing who we can apply for and who we might be able to receive extra funds for.
So that's a process that only the schools, it's not up to the parents to necessarily process any paperwork and all
No.
that?
Someone in my department handles all of that. She calculates every penny that we spend on our special needs students so that we can try to recoup some of those funds.
I just want to add some of those funds.
Some.
We don't get it all.
No.
Because there's a pot of money at the state level where they distribute that. So and to try to give an idea to the public about the cost possibly of providing services for some of those students can be $100,000
Yes.
per child.
We have students that are so medically fragile that they require a one-to-one nurse. And a one-to-one nurse is approximately $50,000. So that is just the service to provide the nursing. That has nothing to do, this is just keeping them safe and well.
Teaching part of the admin part.
Yeah, that's just what we have to do. Yeah, these are more unfunded mandates is what it comes down to. Anything else? Okay, Jenny?
So, thank you for letting me talk to you tonight about preschool. This is a new role for me. I'm learning lots. And it was a good time to come in because there were a lot of new rules that went into effect the end of July of this year about preschool. And I have provided you with a handout that looks something like this. Preschool rules are now saying that we have to offer a continuum of services for our preschool students. The continuum goes from the general education classroom all the way down to a special education only setting. So students that are able to participate in the preschool classroom with typical peers and maybe just, like Kathy was talking about, maybe have some less severe needs, speech, articulation, language, would benefit from being in a classroom that has a lot of typical peers. But some of our more medically fragile students or more severely disabled students would need the other end of the continuum of services where they might be in a classroom with just special education students only. Currently, we don't have all of the opportunities that are listed on this paper. We worked with our consultants from the state support team, Jean Applebeck, to come up with this continuum of services that we would like to propose to you to offer for next school year. This continuum of services keeps us compliant with the state in a couple of ways. It allows us to have that full continuum of services that the new laws are stating that we have to have. It also allows us to stay compliant with the staffing and student ratios that the state has made very difficult for all preschools to maintain this year. So the boxes underneath there tell you how many typical and how many IEP students are permitted in each classroom. But in addition to how many are permitted, it is actually required. So if you look at that integrated classroom where it says you can have 8 typical students and 8 students on IEPs, it has to stay in that ratio. So if we have one typical student that for some reason stops coming to our program and we still have 8 IEP students, we're out of compliance. So in addition to having this full continuum, this will also give us a little more flexibility and allow us to stay compliant with what the state is telling us as far as the ratios. This is very similar to the number of classrooms that we have this year. This year we're actually added a classroom about 2 weeks ago, and we're adding another teacher starting Tuesday after President's Day because of the increased number of students. Now, we're not adding those 2 teachers in for next school year because we have so many students going to kindergarten that we'll be fine without those 2 additional positions. So this is the same number of classrooms that we have prior to the addition of these 2 teachers. It's just in a little bit different configuration. It will require the same number of classrooms, but 2 additional teachers for this co-taught classroom. That is not something that we currently have. And by law, you are required to have 2 teachers in that general education preschool classroom. One would be an intervention specialist, and one would be a pre-K to 3 certified teacher. Is there anything else that I need to? Is there any questions for me?
Ms. Thompson, thank you for speaking. You said we're out of compliance if one drops out, they just don't show up. Is that like a day, 3 days, a week, or?
For our enrollment of our program. So with the flexibility here, we would be able to, if you notice there's a special ed with typicals classroom that is very similar in ratio, but you can have fewer typical students than IEP students in that. So that would allow us to stay in compliance then.
Okay. Thank you.
have a question. Do we have any data that just basically shows the benefit that you can get when you have a co-mixed classroom? Because we were talking earlier about the fact that we are, that we do have a nice mix. Do we have something definitive or something as in data that shows the benefits of that so that, you know, parents, typical parents are encouraged to go ahead on and get their kids started in the preschool program? Because it's not just the benefit for your kid, you know, for the kid that's typical. Data probably shows that it's a huge benefit for the child that is, you know, on the IEP. Is there something that you can add that backs that up? I mean, are there studies that back that up?
There are studies that back that up, and that's why the state has this model. That is their preferred model, is to have IEP students in with typical students for that role model. I don't know that I have any data from Fairfield specifically to back that up, but I could certainly pull many research studies to show that that is an effective model. And as our students get older, it might not be as possible for them to be in a classroom with typical peers, so as much as we can do that while they're young, we like to support that model. We have, you can see on this paper, we have less of the special education only classrooms than the other classrooms because that is our least preferred model to follow.
And our preschool costs generally are pretty reasonable if
Yes.
you're looking at the area.
They are pretty reasonable. We charge $200 a month. It's a half-day program that runs 4 days a week. That is very, very much in line or even a little bit less than what you would find. And we are still having trouble maintaining some of our typical student ratios, especially at West Elementary. We've talked about this a lot. We're not sure whether it is, I hate to say that COVID word again, but you know, parents struggling financially because of those kinds of hardships, or why we're having a hard time maintaining that ratio at West. We do have more classrooms there, so that might be the other reason that we are. We don't seem to be having that same trouble at our program at East.
Thank you.
This could be pure ignorance on my part. Do we have any like programs for assistance on the fees?
We do not for preschool at this time.
Yeah, I mean, because you said $200 a month. I recall when I had my kids in preschool, and that's a lot of years ago, but those prices are probably just a little bit more than what I paid, like, you know, I won't say how many years, but obviously a long time ago. I mean, and I think the 200 that's a really reasonable rate, but there's still going to be parents that struggle, and I think there are some federal programs that might be applicable for students. So, you know, I think it's important that we encourage parents who's, you know, whoever's out there listening. It is important. If you've got a little one and they're about to enter that age group, consider sending them in, because that is a benefit in many ways. And so we're right here, and obviously West has plenty of space if you're in that area.
Yes, they do. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
And our next item for board discussion, administrative salary ranges. I'll turn it over to Mr. Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. From time to time, it becomes necessary to adjust our administrative salary ranges. We have two areas on our salary ranges. We have professional administrators and then our support administrators. Tonight, we would like to discuss raising the upper limit of two of our support administrators, range 1 going from a top of $95,000 to the top of $100,000, and range 3 going from a top of $125,000 to $140,000. As we keep people enrolls longer and longer, and they get raises, and salaries across the state and nation raise. It just becomes necessary from time to time to raise those upper levels. So those are our recommendations for you. We'll bring these back to vote on at our next meeting, but do you have questions about these ranges? Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, our next item, additional EL tutor needs. I'll turn it over to Mrs. Aug.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Begley, members of the board, I have an item for discussion tonight regarding the need for additional EL tutors for this school year. As you know, the board has approved staffing guidelines, which include suggested tutor to student ratios for K-5 at 1 tutor for every 50 students and 1 tutor for every 15 students in grades in grades 6 through 12. Tutor positions are not permanent, so these tutors will be hired only for the remainder of the school year. So at this time, we have the following needs. We have the need for a half-time tutor at East Elementary and also at West Elementary. We have a need for a full-time tutor at North Elementary, and this would bring our total number of tutors in the district to 45. So this is my item for discussion tonight. Do you have any questions for me?
You're looking for approval?
Yeah, just a head nod that we can go ahead and post.
Great.
It's
Needed.
Agreed.
Yeah, we're hoping we can find someone. It's been difficult to fill these positions this year, so, but it's a need, so thank you for allowing us to post.
And these are all both EL, right?
Yes.
All right, our next item, FCSD 2022-2023, membership in the Ohio High School Athletic Association. It is that time of the year for the school district to renew our annual membership in OHSAA for the next school year. So you will see that item listed this evening as an item for board action. Again, this is something that takes place every year so that we can renew our membership. Any questions on that? Thank you. Our next item, school bus purchasing program. I'll turn it over to Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. The school bus funding program, which is through the state of Ohio, we were recently awarded approximately $135,000. And to break that total down, it is to replace 3 buses. So we were awarded $45,000 per bus to replace 3 buses, which is about 40% of the cost of a new bus. The criteria of the buses that must be replaced is that they must be at least 8 years old and must have a minimum of 96,000 miles. I'm working with Mr. Westerbeck to identify the worst in the fleet, lack of a better term, to identify which ones we need to replace. And in the future, I will be coming before the board with a resolution to participate in the EPC bid pricing for to purchase buses. EPC is the Southwest Ohio Educational Purchasing Council. This has been the past practice of the district, and it is the best practice to purchase, the best price to purchase buses. So pretty much what we're saying is the state just let us know we got $145,000 and we say thank you. So as we work through that process with Mrs. Lane to identify how many buses that we will be replacing, it looks like we'll at least be doing 3, so, which is great news.
There shouldn't be any problem to find 3 buses that meet that criteria, right? We have plenty of older buses with high miles on them.
Great news.
Good.
Thank you, Bob.
Do you have a question, Mrs. Shorter?
I do. Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Perry, I hate to bring this question up because it's a matter of, we're getting money in, but I have a feeling a lot more of it's going to go out. As we were listening to the information about the increase in special needs with IEP coverage, what about our buses for special needs consideration, especially since we have medically fragile kids? Have we looked at, where that cost is going to go? Is that a cost that's coming? Are you anticipating that we're going to have to expense a lot more money in our busing fleet in order to handle the influx of our medically fragile students and the students with general special needs?
Correct. Overall, our fleet is able to handle the growth that has been projected. Luckily, the majority of the buses we purchase can handle the vast majority of the needs of all of our students. There are very specific transportation needs when we get into wheelchair, et cetera. But right now, at this point in time, there is a replacement cycle that we do have, but in the near future, we are projected to be just fine. But we do monitor and keep an eye on that for sure.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just for my own benefit, what do we do with the old buses?
Usually we trade them in. Quite frankly, by the time it's time for us to replace the bus, we've exhausted the life of the bus beyond its normal wear and tear. And typically that's the normal process, is that by trading it in, it also simplifies the process and the paperwork to do so. We do receive some money. It's not a great deal. Again, by that point in time, usually we've had buses close to 500,000 miles and greater than 10 years old. So our mechanics do an excellent job of keeping the buses on the road safely. Of course, they're regularly inspected by the state highway patrol. But yes, by that point in time, the easiest way to do is just to trade them in.
Thank you.
Yep. Excuse me.
Anything else?
All right, our next item for board discussion, we have a few board policies to discuss, and it looks like Mrs. Aug will be discussing the first one.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Begley, members of the board, I have one policy for your consideration tonight. That is policy IGAI and IGAH, Family Life and Sex Education. This policy has actually not been updated since 1995, so it was overdue for an update. So I worked closely with my curriculum coordinators, both elementary and secondary, and our instructional specialist in this area to review the policy. We also worked with Mr. Clemens to review the policy to make sure that it aligns with OSBA's recommended policy and meets the needs of the Fairfield City School District. So, as with all policy, we must adhere to the statutory requirements of Ohio Revised Code, and that is stated here in number 3. And then we also wanted to make sure, as part of the policy, that staff members and parents realize that students can be excused from instruction that they might find controversial by submitting a written request to be excused. Parents and guardians may also ask to review instructional materials during the school day. And finally, if we go beyond what is required in any instruction regarding venereal disease or sexual education specifically, parents and students will be notified. So this concludes my item for board discussion. Any questions for me?
No, I don't think so.
All right, Mr. Martin?
All right, thank you, Mr. Smith, Mr. Begley, and board members. I'd like to speak about Regulation JECBD-R. This is our interdistrict school enrollment. Mr. Crapo has worked closely with getting this policy, suggesting the changes for this evening. The words throughout this policy, it talks about interdistrict, but sometimes the words open enrollment is used interchangeably with intradistrict. We're going to change all of that to intradistrict at this point in the policy. We've also had to revise this regulation every year because we put specific dates that the applications were due each year, and they changed each year. So now we've kind of come up with language that removes specific dates and and it's a more general language, so it won't have to be required to be changed every year. For instance, we say the first Friday in May, they're due, instead of giving a specific date, so people still know when they're due. The only other change is that the board regulation has been made to reflect that the process is now electronic rather than a paper process. That's all the changes we're making in this. Any questions about JECBD-R?
Reading that, there was a lot of talk about interdistrict program transfers and so on. Do we get a fair amount of that? Is that a struggle for the district?
You mean
Do we have a request for a lot of intra-district transfer?
Yes,
among the, I
yes,
guess,
we
elementaries?
every year we have many more than we're able to fit into our classrooms. But part of the reason for that, we have to wait so late in the year because many people register late, like when they see the school buses going down the street, they decide to. So we have to have room for our own students first. And so we look very carefully around the 1st of August to see how many students we can comfortably put in our classrooms, but we still want to save room for our own parents who are registering maybe a little bit later. And so, so there are many people who apply each year that do not get in, but we are accepting hundreds of each year. So we get a lot, but we could get twice that many if, if there were enough room.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?